Hello and welcome to Media Monitor on the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial. Now, this is where we take a look inside the world of media, analysing the trends, the issues and the reporting of some of the week's top stories. I'm Peter Ndoro, and this is what's coming up on the show today. Now, as the deadly coronavirus continues to spread across South Africa and around the world, so too is misinformation and fake news. Today we find out about some of the interventions in trying to curb this scourge. Our international editor feature this week takes us to Kenya and Zimbabwe, and they give us updates on how the media is telling the COVID-19 story. Zimbabwe, you may know, now has 2 cases confirmed. In our News and History feature this week, we take you back to 1997 when South Africa observed Human Rights Day. So that's the show for today. Remember, you can engage with us on social media using the Twitter handle #SABC Media Monitor, #SABC Media Monitor. But before we get into these stories and more on the program, let's first take a look at what's on the front pages of your Sunday newspapers, starting with the Sunday Times. And this is the Sunday Times story. The Sunday Times is leading with talks about frightening new projections of COVID-19 infection rates. And these have the military on standby to be deployed to patrol streets to delay the need for a countrywide lockdown. The City Press, well, the headline there is Virus Havoc, and this speaks about the National Command Council meeting today, with Treasury warning of a triple crisis if the virus is not contained by whatever means necessary. Treasury has fears that stock markets could be wrecked and the already paralyzed economy could be badly hurt. The Sunday Independent is the story is about South Africa could be moving towards the edge, with the infection numbers now up to 240. Fears are that the country could be heading towards a national lockdown similar to the ones currently imposed in Italy and parts of China. The Sunday Tribune, COVID-19 story there talks about 40 South Africans that are stuck on board a luxury Italian cruise liner. The ship, the Costa Luminosa, they're being kept in isolation in their cabins after 6 passengers tested positive for the virus. One American passenger described the cruise as a living hell, and a Facebook post says, "We are being fed like animals in a cage." Not a great experience for them. The Weekend Argus on Sunday is running the same cruise liner story with South Africans on board. Passengers are said to be scared after the ship was denied entry at 2 ports in Antigua and Spain. Passengers are complaining about not being told about people on board being sick. And the Sunday World's top story speaks of a Yop actress who has laid a rape charge against a Joburg-based advocate. This 30 years. In fact, that was last week. This week, the controversial MP, of course, who was talking about people in Parliament accused of gender-based violence. He himself is being accused of that, where he's accused of actually knocking out somebody's front teeth. So that's the front pages of the print media. Let's take a look at what captured your attention on social media platform Twitter. And so these are the trends: COVID-19, South Africa, and I suppose no guessing that this is going to be trending for some time. The Sacred Press Space is one of the programs on Radio Metro, which is always quite popular. And the one that grabbed my attention, though, is this one, Rwanda. And there's speculation here in South Africa that we might be following suit soon. And so the story is that Rwanda has gone into lockdown, very much like the way Italy has gone down, and Uganda as well, similar. So people have been posting about this development, lockdown for Rwanda, banning all flights in and out of the country for 30 days as it starts to try to contain this virus. Of course, people have been speculating that the Command Council here in South Africa might lead us down that path quite soon if the infection rate continues to grow at this rate. So Rwanda doesn't have as many cases as us, but they certainly are really going for it and making sure that they cut this off as soon as they can. All right, so that's what's trending on social media. Now, a week ago today, President Cyril Ramaphosa set the tone for a more concerted phase of fighting the COVID-19 coronavirus with an address to the nation announcing a raft of new measures to try and curb the spread of the virus. Now, during the week, the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs gazetted regulations that grant government powers to act against those spreading fake news about the virus, and you could get a 6-month jail term. Well, the president met with opposition party leaders on Wednesday, and the fake news issue was one of his concerns. So too for some of the leaders that sat with him.
We are grateful for all the facts that Dr. Mkhize has given us. And when we have all the facts, then people are able to know what the truth is and not be influenced by fake news. Truth always undermines fake news, and we're grateful for that. And maybe lastly, I must make an appeal to churches that we need to cooperate with government. What the president said on Sunday makes sense.
All right, so that's Kenneth Mweshwe speaking there after a meeting with the president. Well, it seems that this fake news issue just won't go away. Just yesterday, the spokesperson to the president, Kusela Diko, had to take to social media to correct some misinformation that was doing the rounds. She wrote on the Twitter platform, "Stop spreading fake news." The president is not addressing the nation and announcing a lockdown. She was explaining the National Command Council would be having a scheduled meeting today to assess the implementation of the directives announced by the president last Sunday. So, following a global rise in disinformation via digital platforms, and Media Monitoring Africa and its partners, well, they relaunched an online reporting platform known as Real 411 this past week. And this is all in a bid to try and curb this scourge from getting out of hand. Let's take a look.
So during the elections, we obviously saw that there is a need for some sort of platform or area where people can go to report disinformation online, misinformation, or incitement to violence. So together with the IEC, we had launched Real 411, but that was during the elections period and for the elections. And afterwards, we felt that there is still a need for this platform, obviously outside the elections period, and hence you are seeing the relaunch of the Real 411 now.
All right, so before we talk about this incarnation,
Yes.
how successful was it during the elections? Was it used and did it help, do you think?
As a pilot, I would call it period for it, it definitely was successful in the sense that people, we did receive quite a number of complaints, and it really did play a role, especially just near the election date itself, whereby we saw a lot of complaints coming by, for example, with the whole acrylic nails, you're not able to vote, sort of disinformation that was going around. So it was definitely successful for its prior period.
All right, so now we're in this a phase of this pandemic and this natural disaster that we're facing. What kind of things have you started to see that's prompted this relaunch?
So coincidentally, actually, the relaunch happened similar time as this pandemic actually came to arise. And for us, it just emphasizes the importance of having such a platform. And I mean, honestly, currently as ourselves, we're seeing all the misinformation that is going around online. And for us to be launching it at a time where it's needed, I mean, it's a positive impact.
All right, so how does one use it? What will happen from tomorrow?
So what would happen is that people will be able to go to the platform, www.real411.org.za, and in that way they can submit a complaint. Now this is open to misinformation, incitement to violence, hate speech, journalism harassment, and that's the new element that was added to the platform itself. And during this, people will see that they can go through the complaints form, which obviously will require the URL or the screenshot of wherever you saw this misinformation and further details about the person themselves.
And then what do you do with this information?
So this information goes through the DCC, and this is a committee made up of experts, and they go and review the complaint itself, obviously to determine as to whether is this really disinformation and misinformation, and then the person who laid the complaint will be informed as to what action will be taken afterwards.
And typically, what might that action be?
So, I mean, it depends on what was posted online. But as I said, this is a platform whereby we're working with various entities, and it's not necessarily only us, the civil society, who are handling it. So it depends as to whether was it maybe a Facebook post, or was it a Twitter post that was done, or is it a WhatsApp message that's going around. So depending on what type of or what format the complaint comes in, that will determine as to which channel it will go
So let's take an example. Somebody posts on a website that if you're black, don't worry, you're not going to get coronavirus because it's a white man's disease. I see this, I'm horrified, and I can't believe that somebody's done this.
Definitely.
I go on to Real 411, screen grab, post and say, look at this rubbish. This is outrageous.
Yeah.
Can you then go to the person who posted this and force him to put it down?
I mean, that's the importance of us working hand in hand with Twitter, Facebook themselves, because they obviously play a very big role in us being able to actually take that information down. And the positive part about the platform is it's very versatile in terms of who we're working with. We've got legal experts, we've got the big social media platforms that we are trying to incorporate in there.
Will you be able to deal with the volumes? Because I think what can happen very quickly
is, I mean, currently we're really putting all in place, because we understand, especially now, the period that we're launching it in, we're at a hike of disinformation that's going around. So definitely in terms of capacity, we've put measures in place to deal with that. So we definitely think that we can take it on.
All right. So you'd mentioned a few names, but who have you come together with to get this right?
So currently, I mean, we're working with various entities. As I said, I've mentioned Facebook, I've mentioned Twitter, I mean, I've mentioned Press Council is also one of them. So it's really made up of private sector, public sector, the government themselves, and civil society, obviously, entities,
All right. Well, we wish you the best of luck. And as you say, anything that can help reduce the noise is very welcome. Thanks so much indeed. And good luck with the project.
Thank you very much.
All right, so that was Media Monitoring Africa's Communications Manager, Nomshado Lubisi, speaking to me earlier in the week. And if you want to report something, you can go to thereal411.org and lodge your complaint on something that you've seen on digital platforms. Well, not surprisingly, disinformation and fake news is not just a local problem. According to a European Union document this past week, Russian media deployed a significant disinformation campaign against the West to worsen the impact of COVID-19 and generate panic and sow distrust.
During a news conference in Brussels on Wednesday, the spokesman for the EU's top diplomat, Joseph Borrell, said that not all disinformation on coronavirus came from Russia, but that they had noticed that some came from providers which are based in Russia or linked somehow to pro-Kremlin sources.
With the start of spreading of coronavirus or COVID-19, we of course noticed that what was increasing was also the number of disinformation, misleading information, outright lies and wrong things which have been circulated.
The Kremlin denied the allegations on Wednesday, saying they were unfounded and lacked common sense. Borrell's spokesman Peter Ndoro accused Moscow of playing with people's lives and appealed to EU citizens to be careful and only use news sources they trust.
It's very important is also like to inform the public and to the people to be aware about this, because whoever, I mean, and it's not only coming from Russia, this is not the only source of the misinformation, but whoever is spreading the disinformation is essentially playing with people's lives. And this is something that needs to be taken into account by the users, but also by the providers and by those who are engaged in distributing and forwarding all this wrong information and sowing the panic or distrust and everything. It's about people's lives.
The EU document said the Russian campaign pushing fake news online in English, Spanish, Italian, German and French uses contradictory, confusing and malicious reports to make it harder for the EU to communicate its response to the pandemic. A specialist EU database has recorded almost 80 cases of disinformation about coronavirus since January 22nd.
All right, stay with us. You're watching Media Monitor. After the break, we've got quite a lot to look at, actually. We go back in history and also hopefully connect with a writer, author, activist in Kenya. Hello, welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor. Now, because of the COVID-19 coronavirus drowning out much of the news, perhaps rightly so, there are some who might have forgotten that yesterday was actually Human Rights Day in South Africa. It was meant to be celebrated on Saturday at the Colesberg Sports Stadium in the Northern Cape under the theme, The Year of Unity, Socio-Economic Renewal and Nation Building. But it had to be cancelled due to the ban on mass gatherings. Well, today we go into our news archives and take you back to 1997 to see how this historic day was celebrated back then. This is how the SABC covered the story.
South Africa has celebrated its first Human Rights Day under the new constitution. The day was marked by rallies countrywide. Politicians made the most of the occasion, touching on issues both constitutional and controversial. Jessica Pitchford compiled this report.
Sharpeville was where it all began 37 years ago. 69 protesters shot and killed by the police.
Kill a man! But like a dog! A dog!
Today, residents of the Vaal Triangle Township remembered those who helped start the spiral that eventually led to democracy. But current issues dominated the day.
We call upon the President of our country, it is our country, to immediately investigate and urgently restructure the National Intelligence Agency, as that agency today demonstrates nothing but an embarrassment to our intelligence. Why have the killers of Chris Hani not been found? Walush was not alone.
At another ceremony, Mpumalanga Premier Matthew Poza had something to say about alleged ANC spies.
We've heard of a new list of Impimpiku ANC. Where was that list all the time? Why are we hearing about that list when there's the TRC? We must be vigilant against those criminals who want to smear our leaders.
Deputy President Thabo Mbeki spent the day with his constituency in Winterveld, northwest of Pretoria. RDP projects have done little to alleviate hardship here, with land remaining the source of much conflict. The Winterveld Crisis Committee accuses councillors of being ineffectual.
We've got plot owners, people that they're owning this land, and then we've got councillors, and then we don't know whom to follow or whom to support.
Sections of the crowd had little time for Mayor Shadrack Dlamini when he tried to speak.
Mr. Deputy President.
The Deputy President was received with more enthusiasm.
I think if the councillors had gone to them and say, this is the program, this is what can be delivered within one period, I think I'm pretty certain they would be satisfied. Because as you could see, they are otherwise not hostile to the government in general.
The problems of Winterveld are a microcosm of those experienced by communities throughout South Africa. And while human rights may be entrenched in the Constitution, it's going to take many years before they become a reality. Jessica Pitchford, SABC, Winterveld.
Now, moving further afield, Egypt revoked press credentials of a reporter for The Guardian and delivered thinly veiled threats of similar action against the New York Times over the coverage of the coronavirus, part of an ongoing pattern of censorship of the press. Egypt's State Information Service demanded an apology from The Guardian over what it called a false report, citing a Canadian medical doctor who said that the number of people infected with disease in Egypt had reached over 19,000. The story, carried by the respected British Daily, was written by Cairo-based freelancer Ruth Michelson, who writes regularly for The Guardian. This past week also, Reporters Without Borders and 120 media outlets and journalists in the West Africa published an unprecedented joint op-ed calling for the release of investigative journalist Ignace Sossou. Sossou was on the 24th of December 2019 sentenced to 18 months in prison and fined for harassment by a court in Benin for posting tweets quoting Benin's public prosecutor during a conference that was hosted by French media development agency CFI. Now, the public prosecutor alleged that his remarks had been taken out of context and issued a complaint against Ignace Sossou at the Court of First Instance, leading to his arrest, prosecution, as well as sentencing. He is being arbitrarily detained and must be immediately and unconditionally released. All right, well, we stay on international issues, and for our international editor feature today, we start in East Africa and in Kenya, where we will find Nanjala Nyabola, who's a writer, political analyst and activist, is based in Nairobi. And let's say good morning to you. Good morning to you, and what do I say? Jambo, habari yako?
Habari yako mzuri sana.
Wonderful. All right, so COVID-19 has really grabbed all the headlines across the world, and rightly so. I think we're up to 300,000 infections globally. How is the story being told in Kenya?
The coverage is definitely getting better, but there was a moment of concern because we also have this political process, this reconciliation process happening between the two major political camps. And there was a lot of concern very early on that political story was displacing a very human interest, public safety, public health story that was emerging. But in the last couple of days, I think the press has started to wake up to the threat and to how complex it is, because it's not just public health. Figure out the public health. We have to figure out what the economy is going to look like after this.
How are the authorities dealing with the issue? What are they communicating?
Again, it's been a mixed bag. Initially, there was a lot of concern, and the Ministry of Health was giving people information that was partial and incomplete. So, for example, we've been getting text alerts. And it was not across all mobile networks. Only the main, the large company in the mobile space was the one that was sending messages. But the other two smaller players, people who were subscribers were not receiving messages. That's changed in the last week. The Ministry of Health has been giving us daily updates, sometimes twice a day. There is a concern that the very small measures, for example, bars will not be open to past 7:30 p.m. when really what is needed, as we've seen in countries that have successfully managed this outbreak, is large, complex policy responses. So, for example, in South Korea, in Taiwan, just giving everybody everything a week to settle down so that we can catch the people who have been ill. We can catch the symptoms early. We can get people the treatment that they need early before it spreads into the community. So it's definitely been a mixed bag where the things are getting better. The question is, are they getting better fast enough? And how do we create a media space where narratives don't displace the very important public health, public information function it's supposed to serve?
All right, we're going to talk about the media in more detail just now. But often I'm always quite curious to see how presidents and heads of state behave during a time of crisis. Often that's when we really know just how much they're worth. How has President Kenyatta been during this crisis?
I think that there is definitely room for improvement. For example, just very quickly, yesterday there was a national day of prayer, which involved gathering about 100 people at the State House, which is completely contravening the government's own public order that there should be no mass meetings. And of course, they said churches and mosques would be an exception. But we've seen in Malaysia, most of about 2,000 cases have been traced to a single mosque. In Singapore, churches and mosques have been epicenters of spreading this disease. In South Korea, we've heard about the infamous patient who was infected and instead of staying in hospital, went to church and ended up infecting over 5,000 people. So, there's a bit of confusion. I don't think that necessarily the president is communicating the seriousness of this issue. I think that, like many African leaders, I think that the senior leadership was just very slow to appreciate the risks that this disease is posing, and especially once it's layered upon our social behaviors and the social choices, going to church, we call them keshas, overnight prayer services. People spend a lot of time in crowds. Religious people spend a lot of time in groups and in crowds. And in other countries, this has been the epicenter. So to have a leadership that is inconsistent in its own messaging is actually incredibly scary from an analytical perspective.
All right. So the other thing that's quite important during a crisis is that the authorities in charge need to inspire trust. And I just wonder, are Kenyans trusting the authorities? Are they believing what they're being told?
I think we're giving them the benefit of the doubt. I think one aspect of Kenyan public life that has really swung into action is the community benefit organization. So the grassroots groups and function of health is maybe struggling to function with. Certainly at the ports of entry, there's a lot of concern. Kenya is one of the countries, there are three countries in Africa that are the epicenters, or four really, of travel: Egypt, Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa. And all four of them have borders, so there's a little bit of concern about border management. People going through the airport have tweeted their concerns about the ineffective screening. There's concern about what self-quarantine actually means. Like it's based on the social contract, but that's not really being communicated. So I think people are really concerned that the government has basically said, well, we can't stop you from doing anything, so do whatever you want. And that's really not what they're saying. Self-quarantine public health process, but it has to be communicated properly. We need to understand what the risks are. At the grassroots levels, these community benefit organizations are trying to provide information, but we've had one person killed in Mombasa because the people around him suspected that he had the virus. Yesterday, we had a woman who committed suicide because she was coughing, and the people in her community thought she was sick. So if we can't be good at raising alarm and be not good at telling people what they need to do to address their fears. So far, we've been so good at raising the alarm, and so people are anxious and scared, but then the government is being slow to swing into action to say, well, don't be scared. Here's a list of things that you need to do to address that.
All right. So what about the media now? What kind of stories have they been telling? And I guess the media in its various forms have got a big role to play in calming people and educating them.
Massive. And it's, like I said, we were very slow off the blocks. There was a lot of political discourse that displaced important messaging, and it left a lot of room for misinformation. You had very senior public figures being given platforms in traditional press to spread misinformation. The rumor that Black people were somehow immune to this disease was given so much traction because we have high-profile figures sharing it and not being questioned and not being put platforms. We saw a lot of the political noise kind of drowning out the public health issue. But again, like I said, the last couple of days have seen a massive shift. We're seeing a lot more experts being given a platform. We're seeing a lot more analysis of the international situation, because what the World Health Organization is saying is that, these things have a curve, and they have a stop yourself being on that path. And so, we're seeing a lot more efforts for people to explain to people that we're on a path trying to arrest this thing early. Helping people understand why schools are closing, why universities are closing, why we're being discouraged from going outside in groups. All of that is happening at a much more accelerated rate than it was even a week ago, which, what we've seen in other countries is a week is a huge difference. Italy a week ago, people were on social media talking about how this thing is a hoax. We're all going to keep going to the bars and we're all going to keep doing whatever. And yesterday they had 725 people die. So there's been a significant shift in Kenya, but the big outstanding question is was it early enough?
All right. So just on that whole point again of education, it's one thing for the media to quote people and explain what government is doing, but it's another to take the initiative and actually say, we are going to educate you about this. Is the media doing much more of that now?
Yeah, it's changed. I would say in the last, because there was a lot of criticism. There was a lot of people saying, you're just not giving this thing the attention that it deserves. So if you look at the front pages today, you'll see, for example, the Standard, their front page is all information. It's all explaining, principles like flattening the curve, what it means to have home care, what social distancing means. That's incredibly important. But then you look on the other side of the Nation and you see it's more of the reporting sort of framework. This is happening and this is a Kenyan who has the sickness, and less of that explanatory public information function. I'll say the big difference is radio. Radio has been tremendous. And the last survey said that 78% of Kenyans still primarily get their news from the radio. So radio has been incredibly important. We have 178 licensed radio stations in the country, so it's a highly fragmented market. But certainly the Kiswahili radio stations that I've listened to and some of the English radio stations that I've listened to, people are trying and really breaking this thing down and trying to get that public education, public information function going. So radio has been a good thing in many ways.
All right, so you mentioned some papers. Let's just take a look at them. What is on the front pages?
So on the Standard, we have lessons, and it's basically they're trying to distill all of the things that have happened in other parts of the world, try and explain the key terms, the key processes that are happening. So self-quarantine, flattening the curve, what does that mean? What does home care mean? Why are all of these emergency procedures currently underway? And it's a 7-8 page feature, so that they're going into great detail about what's happened in other countries. I think it's a limitation that they focus on European countries and China, whereas what we also really want to pay attention to is the successes. We want to see, what did Taiwan do? What did Hong Kong do? What did South Korea do? Because that's really where we need to be learning from. It's also really disappointing that we haven't seen as much emphasis on what's happening on the rest of the continent. But overall, the front page is screaming for public information and public awareness. Of course, we can't give up on politics altogether, because politics is the lifeblood of Kenyan media. We have stories about the fragmenting relationship between the president and the deputy president, but overall, that public information is swinging into action.
So
over on the Nation,
carry on.
It's a little bit less. And then over on the Nation, it's a little bit less public information and more reporting. So we've seen, there's a Kenyan who's suffering from the disease. She's been given front page. We have commentators, opinion pieces, a lot of people being given a platform up there. And then we have the front page, which is about an economic dimension, where the government is proposing pay cuts for civil service. Because the piece with Kenya that's also important is the economy was already struggling before this. We were reeling from that disaster cycle in 2017. So all of these government proposals are getting picked apart in the paper for, what will this outbreak make worse in the context of an already struggling economy. Not the public information function that you were alluding to, just more standard reporting and analysis.
All right, so here in South Africa, we've just seen a regulation gazetted to protect people against fake news, because a lot of it is coming through. Is this a problem in Kenya as well? Is this something that you're seeing more and more of?
It's an enormous problem. And with most African countries, the real big challenge is WhatsApp, is the dark web, is all of these conversations that are happening in a place where we can't measure, where we can't really get into analyze. Because I think when someone puts fake news on Facebook or on Twitter, it's become easier to call them out on it. But certainly in the first week when the first cases in Africa started to emerge, I mean, my WhatsApp was full of people sharing all kinds of misinformation. Hot lemon and ginger will cure you. Don't eat ice cream. Stay away from this neighborhoods. This disease only affects white people. It doesn't affect black people. Like, the misinformation has been enormous. And this, it goes back to what you were saying about the public information function. When we say what's the problem, we say that people are not the problem with fake news. We say, well, people are taking information from news sources that they shouldn't trust. And trust is the key thing here. And I think what we've seen is that the erosion of trust in news sources, the Ministry of Health, the newspapers, the places where information has to be verified, is leading people to get information elsewhere. And so I've been saying this, online, and I say it all the time. There's no such thing as over-communicating during a crisis. We need to hear very clear, very well packaged, very well explained information from the Ministry of Health, from senior government officials, as often as possible. Be that annoying person that is just hammering on and on and on, because otherwise anxious people will start to get their information elsewhere. We already have a legal framework against misinformation and disinformation in Kenya. It's a very problematic framework. It's legally very problematic. It's been used primarily to punish critics of the state. So we don't want to reach into a situation whereby we're leaning on laws that are designed to punish free speech. Instead, what we want is for the government and give people information that there is no use for the misinformation, that it actually becomes irrelevant.
All right, and perhaps to close off this conversation, there's something that I was pondering on this past few days, is that the COVID-19 conversation is important and it must be one that must be front and lead, but are we telling other stories? Because there's a danger, I think, that if you tell one story and one story only, you actually start to suck out life from people and they're perpetually depressed. Is there space there as well for other news? I know here in South Africa, we drowned out pretty much everything else.
I completely agree. I mean, I think there's a lot of study that has been done, for example, about how when people put in place emergency measures too early in terms of a crisis, then people get bored and they start to break the emergency measures sort of a week, 2 weeks into it. We lose interest. It's beyond our attention span. So, in the same vein, if we saturate the media space with this one story, do we then lose our capacity for keeping it in context the rest of life, which is still continuing? People are still going to work. I think the challenge with COVID-19 is that it is, from a media perspective, it's very easy to package as a story. It has all of the elements that, media is designed to capitalize on in order to move people, in order to move copy, in order to get people's attention. And so we do, from an editorial perspective, have to find a balance between the urgency, because it is urgent. It is important. This is an inflection point for modernity. This is an inflection point for the way in which our societies are organized. And so from the editor's perspective, your goal is to keep that level of seriousness and alertness without drowning out everything else. And so the tendency has been in many media markets to swing between the very alarming and the very scary and the very banal and the very sort of mundane things. So, even if you look at the front pages of the paper in Kenya today, it swings between, oh my goodness, the economy might fall apart, and the other side is, well, here are 3 things that you can do with your kids. And I think that oscillation is also very dangerous. I think you're trying to find a consistent tone that reminds people that life must still go on, even as we're being serious. And I think, to me, a big part of that is, again, we need public health entities to really swing into action and to perform that public information function so that the press can focus on the business of keeping people informed and keeping people rightful context. It's definitely an important moment. I don't think that will be the same again as humanity. Decide what we want the next stage to look like for all of us.
All right, Nanjala, always a pleasure talking to you. Always great insights, powerful views. Thank you so much indeed. Asante sana. All right.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so that's Nanjala speaking to us from Nairobi. Great insights on how the media is working and the kind of stories and how those stories should be told. Analysis, of course, as well about the authorities and how they're managing the situation there. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll have more for you. We'll start looking at newspapers here at home, and hopefully also a sneak peek of what's happening in Zimbabwe now that they have 2 cases recorded there. Welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor. Now, we were hoping to be able to talk to our reporter, international editor in Zimbabwe, but they're going through load shedding at the minute, which is a challenge, as you can imagine. But there are a couple of stories that have played out, particularly around COVID-19. And I can tell you that Zimbabwe has now reported its second confirmed case of the coronavirus. This follows the first case of a 38-year-old man from Victoria Falls who had traveled to the United Kingdom earlier in the month. Now, the number of SADC countries with COVID-19 cases now stands at 7. And I've got to tell you that globally, more than 300,000 people have been infected by this viral infection, with over 8,000 people having lost their lives.
Today, the 21st of March 2020, the National Microbiology Reference Laboratory at the Salim Gale Central Hospital confirmed yet another case of COVID-19, which brings to 2 the number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Zimbabwe. This second patient is a 30-year-old male resident in Harare who had traveled to New York, United States of America, on the 29th of February 2020. And returned home in Harare on the 9th of March 2020, and he came through Johannesburg. He started exhibiting mild symptoms, flu-like illness, on the 12th of March 2020, which progressively got worse on the 19th of March. He consulted his doctor, who advised him to self-isolate at home. The doctor alerted the local COVID-19 rapid response team that immediately went in to assess him and recommended that he continues with the self-isolation at home. Specimens were collected and sent to the reference laboratory for testing. Yesterday evening, he developed severe respiratory distress, and after stabilization at home, he was admitted for isolation and clinical management at Wilkins Hospital. The reference lab confirmed his COVID-19 positive results early this morning. Our teams are now engaged in contact tracing, and as with the first case, are being assisted by the patient himself. Once again, we call upon everyone to remain calm as we manage these confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Zimbabwe.
So that's the Health Minister, Obadiah Moyo, yesterday explaining that 2 people now have been confirmed to have the COVID-19 coronavirus. And there are fears, of course, that if this becomes full-blown, that Zimbabwe's already struggling healthcare system might not be able to cope with a rapid increase in infection rates there. So we'll be watching that story for sure. But there was controversy as well in Zimbabwe because not so long ago, the Defense Minister, Opa Machunguri Kashiri, took to the stage in one of the cities outside Harare. And this was before these cases of COVID-19 were confirmed. And this is what she had to say, and it really did get quite spicy.
Coronavirus yauya masanctions auya kunyika dzinotisira masanctions mwari wabhati wakuswera wari muZimbabwe uisinamba ikonomi yavo yakuchema handiti yedu iri vari kutichemedza. Trump ngaazive kuti haasi mwari. Muri kuda kuti tisvinwe tiendepi? Chimbosvinwaiwo necoronavirus. Kurwadza kwazvinoita.
All right. So that video was courtesy of a journalist in Zimbabwe, Hopewell Chiono, who posted that on Twitter. So the president actually had to come out and censure that statement, saying that, look, there's scientific and medical evidence to prove that this is a global problem and that we should all work together. But the defense minister, as I said, causing all kinds of controversy and backlash on social media. All right, coming back to South Africa and the newspapers, we're now joined in studio by Shweshwe Kru, who's the station manager at Wits Radio. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for coming through to help us unpack the story of our newspapers. And I can almost guess already that headline stories all about COVID-19 coronavirus.
Yes, and as we social
distance exactly.
I think there are, most of the newspapers are covering the COVID-19 virus. You see the Sunday Times saying stand still, and you see the City Press say virus havoc, and the story there is that the National Command Council will meet today because there are some measures that are needed to be put in place. I think you mentioned it earlier on when you were speaking to the journalist in Kenya, is that there's so much, there's fear, there's anxiety, and then there comes the media also. We do add to the fear and anxiety. Yes, there are some stories on some of the newspapers, even including on the City Press, that I'm holding on now, that does not only just focus on the COVID-19 virus, but there's so much fear that people have just generally. But I think we do need to take care. Everyone is worried that we don't want to see another case of what we're seeing happening in Italy, because when they had their warning signs, they didn't take it seriously. But I don't know if we will get there in South Africa.
It is quite scary, isn't it? But this Command Council that's meeting today, rumours already start floating around that we're going to see a Rwanda-style lockdown being announced.
Well, at this present moment, I wouldn't really want us to speculate. I think one of the things that we have to start learning now as South African, and I feel we really haven't gotten to it, is that we need to trust our government and trust that they will lead us in this. We have been advised to stay at home, don't go out if you don't need to. And the president has said, if you want to travel home to Limpopo or faraway places, rather not do it. Stay here. Are we going to get to a point where the advice is a total lockdown? I don't think we need to get to that point if we as citizens also take responsibility. And I think the issue is that because of the fear that everyone has, you do have other people on the extreme end that are saying, well, I'll believe it when I catch the virus. We've seen inserts of those people here on the SABC. We've seen stories on radio reflect this. I think we have to wait and hear what the National Command says. And I think what's very important is for us to absolutely cease from speculations. Even on, some of them are fueled by social media. And unfortunately, we almost need to get to a point where we're saying there needs to be one voice that will communicate messages with South Africans. And if another voice says something else, we shouldn't trust it in a way.
And this is something that's been playing out quite a bit, actually, where respected people on social media are retweeting things that are not known. I mean, yesterday we saw the presidential spokesperson actually having to tweet saying, stop spreading this fake news. That's how bad things got. So Sunday Times?
The Sunday Times stand still, and they've got the picture of the, I don't know if this Victoria Wharf at the waterfront in Cape Town, and you can see it's, there's no one, there's a few faces there and there. Yes, people are panicked, and I think the question we should be asking ourselves as broadcasters and journalists is, what are we doing to allay the fears that people have? What role can media be playing? If you do listen to some of the public service stations, what you will hear are adverts encouraging people to wash your hands, keep social distancing.
Whilst you're talking, we're just seeing an image of President Cyril Ramaphosa, who's meeting this Command Council, and they're going to have this conversation as that we've been describing, and hopefully coming out of that we'll get a better sense of what happens in this next chapter. It was a week ago, of course, the president spoke about these new measures that were coming into play, and as you were saying, fear needs to be managed, but we also need to do the sensible things: social distancing, washing your hands 10 times a day, And,
for 20 seconds with soap and
Yes.
water. And I think some real questions have been raised. Social distancing is easy for us. For many South Africans who live in informal settlements, this is the size of the house. And if there's 3 of us in a room, how are we going to social distance? It's going to be a challenge. When there's no running water or access to soap, you know, what will happen?
Shosha, we always run out of time, unfortunately, on this program, but thanks so much for coming through and helping us make sense of these headlines. And we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Shosha.
Thank you.
All right, and that's where we're going to leave it for this week. Thanks very much indeed for watching Media Monitor. And we hope that you'll join us again same time next week with more of the same. Have a great week in between and be sensible and stay safe.